my new book coming out with Inner Traditions.
Something about the Simpsons, right?
Yeah, about the Simpsons. Homer and the Heart of Theurgy, Foreshadowings of a Ritual Tradition is the title. That's the tentative title. It will likely change by the time of publication, but what it concerns is a practice called Theurgy, which is it's a combination of two words, meaning God and work. So it can mean the work of God, or it can mean to work with God or the gods. But it arose in and around the 2nd century AD after Christ, and it the thing is, it's dated to that era. Everyone agrees Theurgy didn't exist prior to that. But when I was researching it, the persons that we know that were actually practicing Theurgy, predominantly Neoplatonic philosophers, late Platonists.
Neoplatonic.
Slow
down.
They didn't call themselves Neoplatonists. That's a term.
Yeah, obviously. So Plato was a dude. So this is the way I think of these guys, because we're just now finding out about like quantum states and things, and looking back into these original like D&D dice, like these perfect shapes. And the tesseract of the cube, and you take these perfect shapes geometrically and you start looking at them in different dimensions, and it sort of fits better than most of the crap that we've come up with for a long time. So it's very interesting, because you have these guys who did not have computers, who sat around and reasoned their way to this, and in the modern era, it's taken us decades with supercomputing to realize, oh, well, actually those guys were onto something, and they used their brains. They just sat around and thought about it. So Platonic solids and the beginnings of that kind of stuff is, explain Plato and what Platonism is.
That'd be a long discussion. We
got like 5 minutes. Go for it.
Yeah, we can get into Plato at another time. But these people were late Platonists, and they're practicing this ritual called Theurgy, which, according to them, is a process by which the soul is able to leave the body and travel up through the various levels of the cosmos, of the heavens, and ultimately unite with one of the gods, the demiurge, the one. Different regions of the cosmos are accessible to these theurgists theoretically, but so that's what they're doing. And they project both the theory and the practice of this into Homer. Now, Homer, the one who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, the famous blind poet, hexametrical poet from 8th century thereabouts. Now, there's not one Homer. There's likely multiple people who contributed to these texts.
Oh, I didn't know that. Like Merlin, like there's a lot of historical figures were multiple people.
But so they projected into Homer. Well, herein lies the other problem. And most scholars agree that in the time of Homer, the image of the soul was such that you as a person are already yourself, as most yourself you're going to be. And when you die, you have a soul, but your soul is something more akin to a shade, like an echo that slowly, possibly peters out. But in any case, it's consigned to Hades. And there might be certain events where that soul is allowed to leave, but that soul is a spectral shade of that person, unlike our modern idea of
isn't that soul being saved?
Unlike our modern idea of the soul, where the soul is more us than our body, and the body is just a container that holds the soul that is actually us.
I mean, when you have an out-of-body experience, it sort of feels that way. It's freeing. There's the pain. The weight of your body is gone. You can think more clearly, if you've ever had that kind of out of body type of thing. So
Well, it
I can
seems to be a
see.
pretty like unhappy experience. And Homer,
Well,
the shades and Hades aren't
yeah,
happy. But
yeah.
then Theurgy
Oh yeah,
is saying that you can, it's a lot like salvation of the soul, but it's in a very different context. Jan Blickus, for example, one of the Neoplatonists, certainly uses terminology like salvation. But the interesting thing I'm trying to get at is that during the time of Homer, the soul wasn't thought of as being the seat of the intellectual self and the emotional self. It was the shade of the self that wasn't really, it was a very sad caricature of the self in a way. Then all of a sudden, in and around the time of Plato, we get this very shaman-like, as Nadler described it, Jeremy Nadler, shamanistic image of the soul, where the soul is now more us than the body, and it can leave the body and go on these trips through the cosmos in the form of a bird or a deer, things that he believes they inherited from farther north in Siberia, Siberian shamanism, and he might not be wrong. But so the point is that, like E.R. Dodds, famous Greek scholar E.R. Dodds, he said this image of the soul doesn't enter. He said the image of the soul is something like this, as something that can leave the body, doesn't enter Greek thought until around the 6th century. That's 2 centuries after Homer. And here we have the people who are actually practicing theurgy saying, they're, or at least projecting it into the time of Homer, 200 years prior to E.R. Dodd's proposed introduction of this, what he called Scythian or Thracian influence from the north, that brought this new idea of the soul with it, that eventually influenced Plato and Platonists after him. So my book, in a nutshell, looks at the real possibility, maybe not so much that Homer theurgy is identifiable in Homer, but why did they think it was? Let's pick apart the reasons they thought it was in Homer. So that's what the book is.
Interesting. Well, I mean, if there was a historical difference, it's like you'd really have to, I guess, pick and choose, like scholastically. But what do you think?
About what aspect of it?
I mean, it's God. It's either one or the other, isn't it? Like you can't have it both ways at that point. It's like either the soul is a shade, either the body is more real or the soul is more real.
Right. And that's a worldview that shifted sometime between Homer and Plato, but
which is way after Christianity, and Christianity is way after the Sumerian, whatever you want to call the way they looked at the world, but they had their own Genesis.
Plato is BC, so Plato is before Christ. Christianity is ultimately influenced by Plato.
Ooh, so I've got this wrong. Mm-hmm. Okay, so
Saint Augustine was a Platonist, for example.
So in tracing us back, the one influenced the other, but so the Sumerians obviously had Genesis and the flood story. They had those, and then 1,000 years later, the Old Testament, the Jews, and they had another big chunk, the same kind of stories, a little more of them, but there never was a Christ figure at that point. It's like, at what point is it about the middleman and the salvation of the soul, and the soul being more important than the body? And when does this shift happen then?
So salvation of the soul as a root idea,
always through a middleman.
According to Nadler, it seems to be what maybe according to my readings in Nadler and Osman, Jan Osman, is that his first name? I think that's his first name. But they talk about how the Pharaoh was different than the rest of the people in that his soul upon death was preserved in what the Neoplatonists called the noetic sphere, that's represented by the fixed stars. So there's this idea that that's where we get this notion that, like, when the Greek heroes die,
Is that Ptolemy that peeks through the spheres? Like
they
that
become the idea that if you die, the Greek heroes become a constellation, right? Well, they don't become constellations, they become saved in the noetic sphere, which is beyond the realm of the planets. The realm of the planets being what's called the realm of the psyche, or soul, the psyche in Neoplatonism. So in this view that Egypt is sort of like proto-Neoplatonism, to coin a really fucked up term.
Proto-Neoplatonism.
Proto-Neoplatonism.
Okay.
There's this idea that the pharaoh is preserved, saved, and that's what the mummification process is geared to do, to represent processes that are happening in other realms, that are happening in the soul realm and in the noetic realm.
And Isis and Horus was the transmogrification of the Egyptian iconography, became what we largely see as Madonna and Child and those types of things.
Right, and ultimately affected Christian iconography, the same ones we see.
And their ideology too, apparently.
They called them icones also, and it's show up in Dionysius the Areopagite, who was a late Neoplatonist. But all of this is the same ideas. You're exactly right. Yeah. Just imagine that there's the one, the monad, the source of everything.
Yeah.
And he has an intellect. His intellect is the demiurge. The logos, the God that we would think of as God. Now, in his intellect are ideas, ideas or forms. You can think of these ideas as gods. So, or, whatever you can think of that would be close to the divine, but yet not divine.
The top of the monad.
His forms.
Or the,
in his mind are these forms. Now, beyond the intellect, beyond that demiurge, is the realm called psyche, or soul. The world soul is what it's called.
The world soul.
Anima mundi is what it's called. So this world soul.
Okay, let me stop you.
Is what we see when we're tripping.
Is that what would be like all of the unconsciousness part of the yin field, the earth cluster of beings?
You can think of it like that. It's like it's the Egyptian Duat, the underworld, where everything is, it's the realm of the dead, where everything is backwards and surreal, like a Dali painting, a Salvador Dali painting or something.
Jesus Christ.
So the realm of the soul.
We can talk about that at some point. I've actually been to the backwards realm a couple of times.
That's the Duat, and that's what they call Kalunga in the Congo. And they call it psyche or psyche in Neoplatonism. And the psyche, so what happens here is we've got the forms in the intellect of God, in the noetic sphere. And these forms are the seed ideas. So let's say that the forms are numbers, because that's how most of them perceive them, especially the Neo-Pythagorean style Platonists. So let's say the forms are the numbers. Let's just say the numbers 1 through 4. Because in Pythagoras, 1 through 4, you can get the decad from that, the 10, and from that you can create everything. So for him, 1 through 4, that's the forms and the mind of God and the intellect. Each of these are seeds. Let's take the number 4 itself and say, by the time that the seed idea of 4, the form of 4, leaves the intellectual sphere and enters the realm of psyche, it blooms into all of its possible associations. So 4 becomes squares, cubes. It becomes things associated with 4, like honesty, 4 squareness, stability. So